The train screeched as it pulled into the small coastal town of Ashford Bay. Evening light spilled through the smoke-filled sky, and Edward pressed his hand against the cold window. His reflection stared back at him, lines etched across his face, hair touched with gray, and eyes that had seen more than they wished to remember. 12 years had passed since he had last stepped foot here. 12 years since the war had taken him away, leaving behind a father, a family estate, and a town he once called home. He stepped onto the platform with a heavy suitcase in one hand and a walking cane in the other. The cane wasn't for show. His left leg still carried the ache of a German bullet. The townsfolk glanced at him, curious, uncertain. Some whispered his name, others turned away. In a place like Ashford Bay, memories lingered longer than people liked. The air smelled of coal smoke and sea salt. Across the street stood Miller's Diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Edward remembered summer nights spent there with Richard Hale, his closest friend, almost a brother. They had dreamed of the future together, making promises over coffee and pie, but those dreams belonged to another lifetime. Now Richard Hale owned half the town, including the Whitmore estate. Edward tightened his grip on the cane and started down the cobbled street. His father's voice seemed to echo in his mind, stern but kind, urging him to be strong. But the house his father built was no longer theirs. It had been signed away, stolen while Edward fought for a country that now barely remembered him. The church bell tolled in the distance. Edward paused, staring at the steeple rising against the dusky sky. For a brief moment, a wave of warmth washed over him, but it quickly turned to steel inside his chest. He had not returned to relive memories. He had returned to confront them. A voice broke his thoughts. "Edward! Edward, is that really you?" He turned sharply. Standing in the doorway of the library was Maggie Collins. Her auburn hair was tied back neatly, though streaked with gray now. Her eyes, wide with both shock and relief, searched his face. Edward's heart softened. Maggie had been a childhood companion, and later, the wife of a soldier who never returned from the war. Time had etched sorrow into her features, but her spirit was unbroken. "It's me," Edward said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. For the first time in years, warmth flickered in his chest. Someone still remembered him with kindness, but behind that warmth burned something else, something sharper, darker, the memory of betrayal, and the silent promise he had made on the battlefield. Richard Hale will pay for what he has done. The library smelled of old paper and dust, a scent Edward had not known he missed until he stepped inside. Shelves stretched high, their wood darkened with age, holding the memories of generations in neat rows of leather and cloth. Maggie guided him in, her step soft against the polished floor. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Not after all these years." Edward set his suitcase by the door and leaned his cane against the table. "I never thought I'd come back," he admitted, "but here I am." Maggie studied his face, her eyes searching for the boy she had once known. She found only a man weathered by distance and war. Yet there was a flicker of recognition, something unbroken. "People said you'd never return," she said carefully. "Richard, he made sure they believed it." Edward's jaw tightened at the name. "Richard Hale," he murmured. The words tasted bitter. Maggie lowered her voice, as though even the walls might be listening. "He came back from the war before you did. Not as a soldier, of course. He never went. He stayed here, bought land, made friends in the right places. And when your father passed, Richard was already waiting." Edward's fists curled at his sides. "He forged something, didn't he?" Her eyes darted toward the door before she answered. "Papers. Deeds. With Sheriff Briggs's help. No one dared question it. Your father wasn't here to defend himself, and you were half a world away. By the time anyone thought to challenge Richard, it was too late." The silence that followed was heavy. Edward felt the old ache in his chest. the one the war had carved, and betrayal had deepened. People are afraid of him now, Maggie continued. He owns most of the shops, the fishing docks. Even the mayor listens when he speaks. He smiles in public, but behind closed doors. She shook her head. Those who cross him don't last long. Edward's gaze hardened. Then it's time someone reminded Richard Hale that Ashford Bay doesn't belong to him. Maggie looked at him, her voice trembling between fear and hope. Be careful, Edward. He's not the boy you once knew. And you... She paused. You're not the same either. Edward picked up his cane and suitcase. No, he said quietly, walking toward the door. I'm not. As he stepped back into the night, the town stretched before him like a stage set for an old play. Familiar, yet strange. The streets whispered of memories, of laughter and loss, of promises broken. Somewhere in the heart of it all was Richard Hale, sitting comfortably on stolen power. Edward tightened his grip on the cane. The war had taught him patience. Now that patience would serve him again. The past was whispering, and Edward was listening. The road to the Whitmore estate was longer than Edward remembered. Once, as a boy, he had run these paths barefoot, chasing the summer wind, his father's laughter echoing behind him. Now the road felt heavy beneath his boots, each step carrying the weight of years stolen. The gates loomed ahead, iron blackened with age but still standing tall. His family crest, once polished and proud, was dulled and chipped. Edward paused, resting on his cane, and felt a cold wave of anger. This land had been his father's pride, built through decades of honest work. Now it bore another man's shadow. He pushed the gate open, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped onto the gravel path. The estate rose before him, stately and familiar, yet hollow. Curtains hung in the windows, but not the ones he remembered. The paint was fresh, the gardens trimmed, the fountain restored, but it all felt wrong. It was Richard Hale's vision now, not his father's. Memories flooded him as he walked closer. His mother's laughter on the porch, his father's steady hands teaching him how to ride. Family gatherings under the oak tree that still stood, its branches spread wide like a guardian. But the warmth of those memories clashed against the cold truth. The Whitmore estate was no longer his. A man in a worker's cap passed by, carrying tools. He stopped, eyeing Edward with suspicion. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked. Edward straightened, number just, remembering. The worker gave a polite nod, but lingered a moment too long before heading toward the stables. Edward knew the look. Richard's men were everywhere, and every pair of eyes carried a warning. This was no longer his place. He moved closer to the porch. His cane tapped against the wooden steps. For a moment, he almost raised his hand to knock, as though expecting his father to answer. Instead, the door opened on its own. Richard Hale stood there. The years had filled him out. Broad shoulders, sharp suit, and the smug smile of a man who believed himself untouchable. His hair was slicked back, his eyes cold, but his voice carried a false warmth. "Well, well," Richard drawled, "if it isn't Edward Whitmore, back from the dead." Edward met his gaze, saying nothing at first. His silence spoke louder than any words. Richard leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You picked a fine time to come back. Though I must say, you might find things have changed around here." Edward's voice was low, steady. "So I've heard." For a long moment the two men stood facing each other, the soldier and the usurper, the betrayed and the betrayer. The air between them felt heavy, charged with years of silence and secrets. Finally, Richard's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "Enjoy your visit, Edward, but don't mistake nostalgia for ownership. This estate, this town, they're mine now." He closed the door with deliberate calm, leaving Edward on the porch. Edward gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles whitened. The old oak tree swayed in the evening breeze, as if bearing witness to the moment. The home was still standing, but for Edward it was hollow, empty of family, empty of truth. Only betrayal lived here now, and betrayal demanded an answer. Morning came with a gray mist rolling in from the sea. Edward walked slowly through the heart of Ashford Bay, his cane tapping against the uneven cobblestones. On the surface, the town looked the same, fishermen unloading their catch at the docks, children running past with school satchels, shopkeepers sweeping their porches. Yet something felt wrong. It was in their eyes. Each time Edward passed, conversations faltered, heads turned. Some whispered, others looked away altogether. The warmth he remembered from his youth, the neighborly nods, the familiar greetings, was gone. In its place was silence, thick and uneasy. At Miller's diner, he sat at the counter and ordered coffee. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, poured his cup without meeting his gaze. "You're Whitmore, aren't you?" she muttered under her breath. "Yes," Edward answered, watching her reaction. She hesitated, glanced nervously toward the window, then lowered her voice. "You should be careful. People who ask too many questions about Richard Hale, they don't last long." Before Edward could reply, the bell above the door jingled. Sheriff Thomas Briggs entered, his badge catching the light. He was broader than Edward remembered, with a belly fed by easy living and eyes that scanned the room like a predator choosing prey. The diner grew quieter as he walked to the counter. "Well, look who decided to crawl back home," Briggs said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "The Whitmore boy." Edward held his ground, sipping his coffee. "It's a free town, isn't it, Sheriff?" Briggs smirked. "Depends who you ask." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Best not to stir old dust, Edward. Some graves are better left closed." The sheriff tapped the counter twice, nodded at the waitress, and left without another word. Conversation in the diner resumed, but softer now, as though everyone feared being overheard. Edward finished his coffee in silence, his mind burning. The message was clear. Richard Hale controlled not just land and business, but the very air people breathed. Fear had settled into Ashford Bay like a sickness. As he stepped back into the street, an elderly fisherman caught his eye. The man gave the faintest shake of his head, a silent warning. Others avoided his gaze entirely. It was as though the whole town had agreed. Silence was survival. Edward paused at the edge of the square, watching the people he once knew move like shadows. Children laughed, shopkeepers bargained, fishermen sang, but beneath it all lay an unspoken truth. Richard Hale owned more than property. He owned their fear. Edward tightened his grip on his cane, the sound of the sheriff's words echoing in his ears. Some graves are better left closed. But Edward Whitmore had not come home to bury the past. He had come to unearth it. That night, Edward sat alone in the small room he had rented above the tavern. A single oil lamp flickered on the table, casting long shadows against the wall. He opened his suitcase, but inside there was little. Some clothes, a few letters, a worn photograph. The photograph was old, edges curled and yellowing. It showed two boys standing by the old oak tree. Edward, taller and proud, and Richard Hale, smiling wide with his arms slung across Edward's shoulder. They couldn't have been more than 15. Edward stared at it for a long time. His chest ached. The memories came unbidden. It was summer once, the sky endless and blue. Edward and Richard had raced through the fields, their laughter carrying on the wind. They'd stolen apples from Miller's orchard, swum in the creek until sunset, and sworn that one day they'd leave Ashford Bay together to see the world. "I'll be a businessman," Richard had said, brushing mud from his shoes. "I'll own ships, hotels, maybe even this whole town." Edward had laughed then, carefree. "And I'll be a soldier, travel farther than you ever will, fight for something greater than myself." Richard's grin had widened. "Then when you come back, we'll build it all together, your honor and my ambition." The laughter of boys echoed in Edward's ears even now, but the warmth was gone. What had once been innocent dreams had curdled into greed and betrayal. Richard had built his empire not with friendship, but with lies and theft. Another memory surfaced, darker this time. The night Edward left for war, the town had gathered at the station to see him off. His father had stood tall, proud of his son. Maggie had wept quietly, clutching her husband's hand. And Richard had clasped Edward's shoulder, his smile strangely hollow. "Don't worry about things here," Richard had said. "I'll look after the estate, like it's my own." Edward closed his eyes now, his knuckles whitening around the photograph. Those words had been the seed of betrayal. By the time he returned, Richard had not just looked after the estate. He had taken it, claimed it, and twisted the town to his will. The lamp flickered, and Edward placed the photograph face down. He could not bear to see the boy Richard had once been, because that boy no longer existed. In his place stood a man who wore ambition like armor and wielded corruption like a sword. Edward leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past pressing on him. The shadows of friendship still lingered, but they were just that, shadows, empty echoes of a bond broken beyond repair. His father's voice rose in his memory, firm and steady. A man's honor is not in what he gains, but in what he protects. Edward whispered into the silence, "Then I will protect what's left, even if it means tearing Richard's world apart." The lamp sputtered, and the room sank into darkness. But in Edward's heart, the fire of resolve burned brighter than ever. Rain fell softly against the library windows, streaking the glass with silver trails. Edward sat at the heavy oak table across from Maggie, Collins, who had closed the doors early that evening. A single lamp burned between them, casting a circle of light over stacks of books and whispered secrets. Maggie folded her hands, her face pale but resolute. "Edward, you deserve to know the truth. What Richard did. It wasn't just chance or bad luck. He planned it, every piece of it." Edward leaned forward, his voice low. "Tell me." She hesitated, glancing at the shelves as though the shadows themselves might betray her. "When your father passed, the estate should have gone to you. Everyone in town knew it. But Richard, he produced papers, deeds, signatures, legal documents claiming your father had transferred ownership to him before his death." Edward's jaw tightened. "That's impossible. My father would never—" "He didn't," Maggie cut in, her voice firm. "Those signatures weren't your father's. Some people knew it, but no one dared say a word. Sheriff Briggs stood beside Richard in court, swore to the judge that the documents were real, and with Richard's money, with his influence, no one could stop him." Edward gripped the table until his knuckles turned white. "So he forged my father's name, and the sheriff covered for him." Maggie nodded. "That's how it began. But it didn't stop there. Richard bought out businesses that couldn't pay their debts. He intimidated those who resisted. Some families just vanished." Her voice trembled at the last word, and Edward caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain tapping the windows. Edward felt the weight of betrayal, pressed down heavier than ever. His father had trusted Richard. He had trusted Richard. And all along, Richard had sharpened the knife behind his back. "Why didn't anyone fight him?" Edward asked bitterly. Maggie looked away. "Because people were afraid. Richard has friends in places that matter, and Sheriff Briggs, he made sure anyone who questioned the papers paid a price. Some lost their shops. Some lost more." Edward rose from his chair, pacing the narrow space between the shelves. His cane struck the wooden floor with each step, a steady beat of anger. "All those years," he said, his voice tight, "I bled for this country. I buried friends in foreign soil. And while I fought, Richard Hale stole everything my father built." Maggie's eyes softened. "Edward, I wanted to tell you sooner, but you weren't here. And once Richard had power, no one dared speak against him. Even now, I'm risking more than I should." Edward stopped, turning to her. "Then why tell me now?" "Because you're the only one who can stop him," she said simply. the only one with a reason strong enough to fight. Edward met her gaze, the fire in his chest burning hotter. The truth had been spoken at last. Richard's empire was built on lies, and Sheriff Briggs had held the scales of justice crooked. But can the Dumide promise Richard had made all those years ago at the train station echoed in Edward's mind. "I'll look after the estate, like it's my own," he whispered into the dim light, more to himself than to Maggie. He kept that promise by breaking it. Maggie reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Be careful, Edward. If Richard even suspects you're stirring old ghosts." She didn't finish the thought, but the fear in her eyes said enough. Edward straightened, his resolve hardening like steel. "Let him suspect. Let him know. I'm done with silence." The rain outside thickened into a storm, and in Edward's heart another storm had begun to rise, one that would not rest until every broken promise was answered. The storm from the night before had left the streets slick with rain, puddles glimmering under the pale morning light. Edward moved through Ashford Bay quietly, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the cobblestones. But this time, he wasn't just walking. He was watching, listening. The town carried whispers, though most people kept their heads down. Doors closed when he passed, windows shuttered quickly. Yet behind the silence, Edward sensed something stirring. Fear, yes, but also discontent. Not everyone was loyal to Richard Hale. Some had simply learned how to survive under him. At the docks, Edward lingered near the fishermen unloading their nets. A grizzled man named Walter, who had known Edward's father, gave him a brief nod. "You ought to be careful, lad," Walter muttered, low enough that no one else could hear. "Hale's men don't like questions." Edward tilted his head. "And you? Do you like what Hale's done to this town?" Walter's eyes flicked nervously toward the warehouses where Richard's enforcers often lingered. "No one does. But speaking against him is like spitting into the wind. Gets you nothing but a mess on your own face." Edward slipped a small silver coin into the man's palm. "Sometimes the wind changes. Remember that." Walter said nothing more, but the faintest spark lit in his eyes before he turned back to his work. Later that day, Edward found himself in the dusty archives of the town hall. The clerk, an elderly woman with failing eyesight, barely noticed him as he requested access to old property records. With patient care, Edward sifted through stacks of ledgers and deeds, his heart pounding as he searched. And there it was, 2 sets of documents, one bearing his father's neat, deliberate signature, and another, cruder, hurried, almost identical but not quite. To untrained eyes they matched, but Edward had grown up watching his father's hand-signed letters, receipts, contracts. He knew the difference. His father's real signature curved gently at the tail of the W, the forged one cut sharp like a knife. Edward slipped a copy into his coat, careful not to draw attention. It was a small piece of evidence, but proof nonetheless. That evening he met Maggie again in the library's dim back room. Spreading the papers across the table, Edward tapped the forged deed with his finger. "This is the beginning," he said. "Richard didn't just betray me, he betrayed the law itself." Maggie leaned closer, her eyes wide. "If you can prove this—" "I will," Edward interrupted, his voice steady. "But not yet. I need more. Enough that even Richard's friends in high places won't be able to bury it." The room fell silent for a moment. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, rattling them like bones. Maggie studied him carefully. "Edward, this won't just be about papers. Richard has men, loyal men, who will do anything to protect him. If you go down this path, you'll be walking into danger." Edward met her gaze, his expression unflinching. "I've walked through worse. Bullets, trenches, battlefields. I didn't come home to live in fear. I came home to end it." The storm in his eyes matched the one outside. For years, Richard Hale had ruled through silence and shadows. But Edward had begun to gather his own storm. Quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. and when it broke, Ashford Bay would never be the same again. Night had fallen over Ashford Bay, and the streets were near silent. A fog rolled in from the sea, swallowing the lanterns in a pale haze. Edward walked slowly down the narrow lane, leading back to his rented room, his cane tapping against the cobblestones. He had tucked the forged documents safely beneath his coat, close to his chest. But tonight he wasn't alone. From the shadows of an alleyway, 3 figures emerged. Broad-shouldered men, their faces half hidden beneath hats, their steps deliberate. Edward stopped, his hand tightening on the cane. "Well, well," the tallest of them drawled, his voice rough as gravel. "If it isn't the war hero himself." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Who sent you?" The man grinned, revealing a gold tooth that gleamed in the lamplight. "Let's just say friends of Mr. Hale don't take kindly to snooping around old papers." The others chuckled darkly, closing in. Edward's pulse quickened, but he stood firm. "Tell Richard," he said evenly, "that no amount of thugs will keep the truth buried." The gold-toothed man stepped closer, his breath hot with tobacco. "See, that's the problem, soldier. Truth don't matter much in this town. Power does, and Richard Hale's got all of it." One of the men shoved Edward hard against the wall. His cane clattered against the ground, and for a moment his leg buckled. Pain shot up through his knee, but Edward clenched his teeth, refusing to fall. The gold-toothed man leaned in, whispering low, "Go back to wherever you came from, because next time we won't just talk." With that, the men melted back into the fog, their laughter echoing down the street until only silence remained. Edward stayed, against the wall, chest heaving. The pain in his leg throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the fire blazing in his chest. He bent down, retrieved his cane, and straightened slowly. His father's words came back to him. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, son. It's standing when every reason tells you to fall." Edward pressed a hand against his coat, feeling the documents beneath. For the first time, Richard Hale had shown his hand. He was afraid of the truth, afraid of Edward. And that fear was a weapon Edward intended to sharpen. The next morning, bruises hidden beneath his collar, Edward met Maggie at the library once more. She gasped when she saw the mark on his cheek. "Edward, what happened?" He waved off her concern. "Richard sent me a message. 3 men in the fog." Maggie's face went pale. "Then he knows. He knows you're searching." Edward set his cane firmly against the floor, his voice steady as steel. "Good. Let him know. Because this fight is no longer in the shadows. It's only just begun." The morning fog still clung to the harbor when Edward returned to the docks. The sea smelled of salt and smoke, gulls circling above with sharp cries. Fishermen moved about their work, eyes low, shoulders hunched, each man wary of saying too much. But Edward noticed one of them, a thin, stooped man with a limp in his left leg, working slower than the rest. His name was Samuel Price, a carpenter once known for building half the ships in Ashford Bay. Now he looked broken, his hands trembling as he mended a torn net. Edward approached quietly. "Samuel," he said, his voice low, steady, "I remember you. You built my father's boat, the Margaret Rose." The man flinched at the name, glancing nervously toward the warehouses before nodding faintly. "Aye. Long time ago, that." Edward crouched beside him, lowering his voice. "I've heard things, Samuel, about Richard Hale, about the sheriff. I think you know more than you let on." Samuel's eyes darted back and forth like a rabbit sensing the wolf. "You shouldn't ask questions, boy. Men who do, they disappear." Edward leaned closer. "I've already been warned. 3 of Richard's thugs found me last night. They wanted me scared. But fear won't bury the truth, Samuel. You saw something, didn't you?" The old carpenter's hands stilled. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant crash of waves. Then Samuel whispered, almost too soft to hear, "It was your father." Edward's heart pounded. "What about him?" Samuel's voice trembled. "He never signed those papers." I know because I was there. Richard came to your father's study late one night. They argued, loud enough for the whole house to hear. Your father shouted that he'd never sell his land, never surrender the estate. A week later, he was dead, just like that. And suddenly, Richard had the deeds. Edward's blood ran cold. You're saying Richard had him killed. Samuel swallowed hard, eyes glassy with old fear. I can't prove it, but I heard things. Saw men leaving the house that night, men who worked for Richard. Your father was alive when I left him. By morning, he wasn't. Edward gripped Samuel's arm. Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you tell anyone? Tears welled in the old man's eyes. Because my boy did. My son, Daniel. He tried to stand up, said he'd testify. 2 days later, they pulled his body from the river. Sheriff Briggs said it was an accident. But I knew better. Since then, I've kept my mouth shut. His voice cracked with grief. Silence keeps you breathing. Edward felt the weight of the words, a grief that matched his own anger. He squeezed Samuel's shoulder firmly. Silence keeps Richard Hale strong. But your truth can break him. When the time comes, I'll need your voice. Samuel shook his head, fear etched deep in his lines. You'll get yourself killed, Edward, and if I speak, I'll follow. Edward straightened, his eyes dark with resolve. Then we both have a choice to make. Live in fear or die with honor. The carpenter looked up at him, searching his face for doubt, and finding none. Slowly he gave a weak nod. If you stand, boy, maybe I'll stand too. But not yet. Not until you have more than words. Edward placed a hand over the pocket where the forged documents rested. Then that's exactly what I'll find. As he walked away, the wind picked up over the harbor, carrying with it the scent of salt and storm. Samuel Price had held the truth in silence for years. Now, at last, a witness had spoken, and Edward knew. Richard Hale's empire wasn't built on strength alone. It was built on fear, and fear was beginning to crack. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. Edward sat in his small, rented room, the single candle on the table flickering against the walls. The bruises from his encounter still ached, and Samuel Price's words echoed in his head. Your father never signed those papers. Edward knew the truth now, but truth alone wasn't enough. He needed strength, proof, voices, allies, yet so far he had walked alone. A soft knock at the door startled him. Slowly, Edward reached for his cane, then opened the door a crack. A woman stood there, wrapped in a dark shawl, her face half hidden in the shadows. She glanced quickly down the hall before slipping inside. Maggie sent me, she whispered. Name's Eliza. I can't stay long. Edward studied her closely. She looked no older than 30, but her eyes carried a lifetime of caution. Why are you here? Because people are watching you, she said, and not all of them want you dead. Some of us, we've been waiting, hoping someone would finally stand up to Richard Hale. Edward's heart stirred. You mean there are others? Eliza nodded quickly. Fishermen, shopkeepers, even a few of his own workers. People who've lost sons, brothers, land. They whisper in corners, but whispering never changes anything. You might. Edward leaned forward. Then why not step out of the shadows? Why not fight? Her eyes filled with fear. Because we've seen what happens. Sheriff Briggs locks up anyone who questions Richard. Some never come out again. Others vanish. Her voice broke. My husband was one of them. Edward felt the weight of her words. I'm sorry. Eliza looked at him steadily. Don't be sorry. Be stronger than him. If you stand, we'll stand. Quietly at first, but we'll stand. And when the moment comes, you won't be alone. Later that night, Edward left his room and wandered the silent streets. At the corner of Market Square, he noticed something strange. A loaf of bread sat on the edge of a stone bench, wrapped in brown paper. On the wrapping, scrawled in quick handwriting, were 3 words, We are watching. Edward picked it up, his chest tightening. Somewhere out there, unseen eyes were following him, not with malice, but with hope. He carried the bread back to his room, setting it beside the candle. For the first time since his return, he felt the weight on his shoulders shift ever so slightly. It was still his fight, his burden, but the shadows had begun to move. The following morning, Maggie noticed the change in his eyes. "Something's happened," she said. Edward gave the faintest smile. "Not something. Someone. There are people who believe Richard Hale's time is ending." Maggie exhaled, relief flickering across her face. "Then you're not alone anymore." Edward's gaze hardened. "Number. And neither is he. The town may be quiet now, but the silence is breaking. Richard built his empire on fear. I'll build mine on truth, and on the people who've been waiting in the dark." He tightened his grip on the cane. The war had always been about more than himself, more than revenge. It was about giving Ashford Bay its soul back. And now, he knew, the first sparks of rebellion had begun to glow. The air in Ashford Bay felt heavier that week. Whispers followed Edward wherever he walked. Shopkeepers glanced quickly away when he entered. Conversations hushed at his passing. He knew why. Richard Hale's grip was tightening, and the sheriff was his iron fist. Edward was leaving the library one afternoon when 2 deputies appeared at the gate. Their boots struck hard against the stones, hands resting on their pistols. "Edward Clarke," one barked. "Sheriff wants a word." Edward's jaw tightened. "If the sheriff has business with me, he knows where to find me." The deputy smirked. "He found you." They flanked him, marching him down the street for all to see. Townsfolk peered from doorways, eyes wide, fear thick in the air. Edward kept his chin high, cane steady, refusing to let them see weakness. At the jailhouse, Sheriff Briggs waited behind his desk, a broad man with cold, calculating eyes. His badge gleamed like a threat. "Mr. Clarke," Briggs said smoothly, "we've had reports of you disturbing the peace, asking dangerous questions, stirring up honest folk." Edward's voice was calm, but steel lay beneath it. "Honest folk don't vanish in the night. Honest folk don't sign away land at gunpoint." The sheriff's smile didn't falter. "Big accusations. But here's the trouble. You've already broken the law." He slid a paper across the desk. On it was a signed statement, claiming Edward had been seen brawling in the harbor tavern, striking a man near to death. Edward's eyes narrowed. "Lies." Briggs leaned back, folding his arms. "Doesn't matter. Witnesses swear by it. You'll stand trial, or rot here in my cells until you do." 2 deputies stepped closer, their hands ready. Edward tightened his grip on the cane, rage burning in his chest. He could fight now, strike, flee into the night, but that would prove them right. Instead, he drew a long breath. "You're not after justice. You're after silence." Briggs's smile widened. "Silence keeps order. Richard Hale understands that. You'd do well to learn it." He motioned, and the deputies seized Edward's arms. The cane clattered to the floor as they dragged him toward the cells. Cold iron bars slammed shut, the lock echoing like a final judgment. Hours later, in the dim light of his cell, Edward sat on the narrow cot, his mind racing. This was Richard's plan, to paint him as a criminal, to strip away his honor, the very thing he had left after the war. But as the night deepened, he heard a whisper at the window. "Edward!" He turned sharply. In the shadows outside, Eliza's face appeared, pale in the moonlight. Behind her, another figure lurked, Samuel Price, trembling but resolute. "We know it's a trap," Eliza said, "and we'll help you. There are others too, but you're not alone anymore." Edward gripped the bars, a spark of hope igniting. Richard and Briggs thought they had caged him, but even here allies were gathering. Edward's voice was low but unshaken. "Then tell them all. Richard Hale believes fear is stronger than truth. He's wrong. And when I walk out of this cell, the whole town will see it." Samuel's eyes widened at his certainty. For the first time in years, the old man whispered words of courage. "Then we'll be ready." The jail was damp, its stone walls sweating with cold. Edward sat on the cot, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the barred window where the moonlight fell like a blade. His bruises still throbbed, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. He had survived war. He had survived betrayal. But now, stripped of freedom and honor, Edward felt the claws of doubt dig deep. What if Richard was right? What if fear always won? The silence pressed in until it was broken by the rattle of keys. Sheriff Briggs appeared, his boots echoing against the stone floor. "You'll make this easier on yourself if you sign a confession," Briggs drawled. He slid a paper through the bars. "Admit the brawl was yours. Take the blame. Plead guilty, and maybe you walk free in a year or two." Edward stared at the paper, then at Briggs. Slowly he tore it in half and dropped the pieces on the floor. Briggs's jaw tightened. "Fool! You'll rot here." Edward's voice was steady. "Better to rot than kneel to a lie." That night Edward lay awake, every creak of the building tightening his chest. And then, faint at first, he heard it. A sound outside, growing louder, carried on the wind. Voices, many voices. He rose, moving to the barred window. Down the street, torches glowed. Figures gathered in the square, dozens, maybe more. Fishermen, merchants, widows, workers. Their faces were hard with fear, but their eyes blazed with something stronger. A single voice rang out. "Eliza. Release Edward Clarke. He is no criminal. He is one of us." The crowd echoed, murmurs swelling into shouts. "Release him! Release him!" Inside, Sheriff Briggs stormed down the hall, rage in his stride. "What devilry is this?" he barked to his deputies. Edward gripped the bars, heart pounding. For the first time, the people of Ashford Bay were no longer silent. Briggs turned to Edward's cell, snarling, "You think they'll save you? They'll scatter the moment I draw my pistol." But Edward saw the truth in the sheriff's eyes. Fear. Fear of losing the one weapon Richard had always wielded. Silence. The chants outside grew louder, torches blazing against the dark sky. Edward lifted his voice, strong and clear, so all could hear through the barred window. "Your chains are made of silence. Break them, and Richard Hale is nothing." The crowd roared, their voices carrying like the tide. For a moment Edward felt the walls tremble with their power. Sheriff Briggs slammed his fist against the bars, face red with fury. "Enough! Tomorrow you hang for inciting riot." Edward's eyes burned with resolve. "Then tomorrow the whole town will see what justice in Ashford Bay truly looks like." That night, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Edward sat in the dark cell. His body was weary, but his spirit had never burned brighter. He was no longer just a man seeking revenge. He was a spark, and the town had begun to burn. Dawn broke red over Ashford Bay, a crimson sky that seemed to mirror the anger boiling through the town. Edward sat in his cell, the chains cold around his wrists. Sheriff Briggs had promised him the gallows by noon, but outside, the world was shifting. The first sound he heard was a bell. Not the church bell, no, this was a handbell, clanging furiously in the square. Then came the voices, swelling, hundreds strong. "Free Edward Clarke! Down with Hale! Justice for Ashford Bay!" Edward moved to the window. What he saw stole his breath. The square was filled. Fishermen with nets slung like weapons, widows with torches, boys and girls clutching stones. Merchants had shuttered their shops, their ledgers tossed aside. Even some of Richard Hale's own workers stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fierce. And at the front, Eliza, her shawl torn back, her voice carrying like a storm. "No more fear," she cried. "Richard Hale has stolen enough. This is our town, our lives. Will you bow forever, or will you rise?" The crowd roared, the sound so great the very windows shook. Inside, Sheriff Briggs barked orders, panic straining his voice. Deputies scrambled, rifles in hand, but hesitation clung to them. They could see the faces in the square, their neighbors, their kin. Briggs slammed Edward's cell with his fist. "Look what you've done! You've poisoned them against order!" Edward met his glare, calm but unyielding. "Not poison. Truth. A rock shattered through the jailhouse window, scattering glass across the floor. The crowd surged forward, chanting Edward's name. Deputies faltered, some lowering their rifles. Then came a thunderous crash. The jailhouse doors burst wide. Samuel Price and 3 fishermen stormed in, wielding iron hooks and clubs. "Edward!" Samuel cried. "Time to walk free!" The deputies backed away, unwilling to fire into the faces of their own people. Sheriff Briggs drew his pistol, but before he could aim, Eliza herself appeared in the doorway, torch in hand. Her eyes burned. "Stand down, Sheriff. The town is finished with your chains." For a moment the world held its breath. Then Briggs fired. Wild, desperate, the shot cracked against the stone wall. In an instant the torch flew from Eliza's hand, striking the desk in flames. The crowd surged, seizing the sheriff's pistol, dragging him to the floor. And through the chaos, Edward stepped from his cell, chains clattering, shoulders tall. The people parted as he emerged, their chants swelling into a deafening roar. He raised his hands, not in violence, but in command. "This is not revenge," he called. "This is justice. We fight not for one man's honor, but for the soul of Ashford Bay." The crowd answered with thunder, their voices echoing through every street, every shuttered house, every trembling heart. Edward Clarke was free, and the uprising had begun. The storm broke over Ashford Bay that night. Rain lashed against the rooftops, thunder rolling like the drums of war. In the square, fires still burned where the crowd had torn down Hale's banners. The town was awake, alive, in a way it hadn't been in years. But Richard Hale was not a man who surrendered. He waited in his grand house overlooking the harbor, shutters locked, guards posted with trembling hands. His wealth surrounded him. Silks, silver, portraits painted too, immortalize his power. Yet every creak of the storm felt like a threat. Every shout outside carried Edward Clarke's name. When the door burst open, Richard rose with pistol drawn. Edward entered, rain-soaked, chains still dangling from his wrists like trophies of defiance. Behind him stood Eliza, Samuel, and a dozen townsfolk, their torches lighting the opulent room with a harsh glow. "Hale," Edward said, his voice low but carrying the weight of the storm, "your reign ends tonight." Richard sneered, though his hand shook around the pistol. "You think a mob makes you strong? I built this town. Without me, you'd all starve." "No," Edward replied, stepping forward. "You bled them dry. You stole their land, their sons, their hope. But tonight, they've taken it back." The pistol rose, aimed squarely at Edward's chest. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, only the crack of thunder in the distance. Then Eliza cried out, "You've stolen enough, Richard!" The townsfolk surged, but Edward lifted a hand. His eyes never left Hale's. "Go ahead," Edward said softly. "Shoot me. Prove to them what kind of man you are." Richard's finger trembled on the trigger. His eyes darted to the crowd, their faces hard, unflinching. In that moment, he saw it, his power, crumbling like sand in the tide. With a roar of frustration, he fired. The shot rang out, but Edward had already moved, striking the pistol aside with the broken chain on his wrist. The bullet shattered a mirror, raining glass across the floor. In a single motion, Edward drove Hale back against his desk, the chain wrapping tight around the man's throat. "You took everything from me," Edward growled, his face inches away. "But you will never take this town again." Richard gasped, choking, eyes wide with fear. For the first time, the tyrant looked small, just a man drowning in his own greed. Edward could have ended it there. One twist, and Richard Hale's life would be over. But instead, he released the chain, letting the man collapse in a heap. Coughing and broken, he turned to the townsfolk. His punishment is not death. It is living, watching the people he tried to own rise without him. Eliza stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Then let him be judged by the people." The crowd roared its agreement. Guards lowered their weapons, stepping aside in silence. Richard Hale was dragged from his mansion, not as a master, but as a criminal. Edward stood in the doorway, the storm easing at last. The rain washed the blood and soot from the streets, as though the town itself was cleansed. For the first time in decades, Ashford Bay breathed free. Edward lifted his eyes to the dawn breaking over the harbor. The war within him was over, not won with bullets, but with truth, courage, and the voice of a people no longer afraid. And so Edward's story comes to an end, not with blood, but with justice, and a reminder that even the darkest tyranny cannot last forever. If you enjoyed this tale, please take a moment to subscribe, share it with others, and let us know in the comments what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Your support keeps these stories alive.